Chapter 820. A huge amount of spiritual power swept out, crushing the heaven and earth. Even the surrounding space in front of him was directly crushed by the pressure. In the broken space of heaven and earth, Tai Yen was surrounded by dazzling light as he shot toward Yen Chutian. Ordinary cultivators at the 5th level of the Heaven Mansion stage might be afraid of such an attack, but Yen Chutian was completely different. Looking at the astonishing power that swept over, he slowly formed a seal. As he formed a seal, the Xianyang qi in his body suddenly began to circulate crazily. Immediately after, in front of his chest, a spatial crack that seemed to connect to a different world gradually appeared between heaven and earth. This was the Xianyang swallow. Yen Chutian naturally had some thoughts about using the Xianyang swallow at the beginning, because he knew very well that although Tai Yen was still overbearing, he would not underestimate him. Therefore, if he fought with his own strength, it would still be a bit difficult. Secondly, in this battle, it was impossible to eliminate the other party. Since that was the case, why use all means to fight to the last moment? He might as well take advantage of the fact that the other party was unprepared. As long as he got the crystal marrow, he could escape directly. Could it be that Tai Yen could reverse black and white in front of so many disciples and cover the sky with one hand? In the blink of an eye, Tai Yen burst out. The palm in his hand carried an astonishing destructive power as it slammed toward Yen Chutian. The Xianyang swallow formed by the latter's seal finally took shape. It went without saying what happened next. When the two collided, the Xianyang swallow immediately burst out with an extremely terrifying devouring power, swallowing all the astonishing palm power. Although he had long known that the other party had extremely strange means, at this moment, seeing it with his own eyes, Tai Yan's heart and even face were inevitably shocked. He could feel how terrifying the devouring power was. When his palm slammed down, the connection with his own attack was completely cut off in an instant. And the situation that followed could be imagined. With the connection cut off, he could only watch as his attack was quickly swallowed by the spatial crack. However, Tai Yen also knew that the attack was not the end. He knew that Yen Chutian was still able to perfectly reflect the enemy's spirit art attack in an almost unharmed manner and return the attack back. Therefore, in the next moment, he once again urged his spiritual energy to form a spiritual barrier in front of his body, firmly protecting himself. He had a sense of propriety when it came to his own offensive power. As a result, he was able to control the defensive power to the greatest extent and not waste a single bit of power. He didn't believe it. Could it be that his opponent could endlessly devour attacks and spit them back out? In Tai Yan's opinion, it was only 2 or 3 times at most. The opponent's strange attack should have reached its limit, but it could not be launched. At that time, it would be the time for him to make his move. Unfortunately, there were 2 big mistakes in his way of thinking. Firstly, it was impossible for Yen Chutian to use the mysterious Yang swallow and mysterious Yang spit in succession within a short period of time. However, the biggest mistake was that Yen Chutian had no intention of competing with him here. From the beginning to the end, there was only one thought in his mind, and that was to get the quasi-7th grade crystal marrow. All in all, the next situation was exactly as Tai Yen had expected from the beginning. While he was condensing his defense, Yen Chutian had already reversed the seal in his hand, gradually transforming the powerful devouring power of the mysterious Yang swallow into a destructive force that was spat out. In the next moment, from the reversed space crack, a destructive force that was almost the same as Tai Yan's previous palm power rushed out crazily toward the outside world. As for the final goal, it was naturally Tai Yen, who was sneering under the layers of spiritual barriers. In his opinion, the situation was as he had expected. Then, the result was that Yen Yun would definitely be defeated by his own hands. Boom! A thunderous boom reverberated throughout the heavens and earth. The power that swept out was not weak, but the final result was that under Tai Yan's sneer, It was almost annihilated at the same time as the spiritual barrier in front of him. This all proved that Tai Yan's grasp of his own power had reached an extremely clear level. However, when the two forces melted, and his eyes looked toward Yan Chutian, the sneer in his eyes became unprecedentedly ugly. This was because not only was the other party not shocked by his precise grasp of power, but he also did not wait for an opportunity to attack him. Instead, he directly grabbed the quasi-7th grade crystal marrow without looking back. Tai Yan was not a fool. He could quickly figure out what Yan Chutian's intention was, but it was precisely because he thought of it that it was more and more difficult for him to accept, because this meant that the other party had no intention of fighting with him at all. And from the looks of it, all those thoughts he had before, were they not just his own foolish fantasies? Damn it! With a roar of rage, how could Tai Yan hesitate in the slightest? He immediately controlled his spiritual energy, and the violent power in his hand swept out like a wave, directly shrouding Yan Chutian. However, how could Yan Chutian, who had already taken the lead, be easily hit by it? Sensing the astonishing fluctuations behind him, he calmly reached out and grabbed the bright red crystal marrow into his bag. Then he used the profound shadow. His figure was like a ghost, disappearing from the original place, naturally avoiding the power that enveloped him. Therefore, Tai Yan's angry attack could only destroy the ground in a mess at most. When the loud roar sounded, Yan Chutian's figure gradually appeared on the low slope. He looked down and saw Tai Yan, whose face was full of unsightly and anger. He did not hide his ridicule. Next time, if you want to rob something, it's better to use your brain first. As soon as his voice fell, he did not care about Tai Yan's reaction. With a step of his right foot, his figure had already sped toward the rear. That was the valley where the disciples of the two teams of their Cloud Sky clan gathered. Fighting was not allowed there. After all, there were many disciples who were recovering or even cultivating. As a result, even if he gave Tai Yan 10 guts, he would never dare to chase after him. However, as he watched the other party leave, he thought of the ridicule that the other party had said before he left. It was as if he was mocking a fool. How could his heart calm down? His anger was like a volcano that could erupt at any time. However, in the end, reason prevailed over anger. Tai Yan gritted his teeth and did not chase after him. He only continuously slapped the ground with his palm, creating dense cracks in order to vent the anger in his heart. At the same time, Yan Chutian had already rushed back to the valley where many disciples were sitting cross-legged. As soon as he rushed back, he familiarly descended towards the position that Maihani had reserved for him. Maihani was already very popular, not to mention that she had now stepped onto the Tianfuging 6th floor. Her cultivation was even ranked in the upper echelons of the disciples, so naturally, no one dared to say anything about it. Moreover, the most they could say was that they were jealous of Yan Chutian. After all, anyone who saw that Maihani was actually taking care of a man would inevitably feel a trace of jealousy. Sensing Yan Chutian's aura, Maihani slowly opened her beautiful eyes. When she sensed that the former's mood seemed to be exceptionally high, she could not help but slightly open her red lips. Why? Could it be that finding a 7th grade crystal essence made you so happy? Hearing this, Yan Chutian just smiled and did not say anything. Seeing his appearance, Maihani, who was originally smiling, could not help but widen her beautiful eyes and say again, "You really found a 7th grade crystal essence?" It was no wonder that Maihani had such a reaction. Even she had not obtained a true 7th grade crystal essence. At this point, Yan Chutian did not hide anything from Maihani. He immediately used his spiritual energy to conceal his aura and took out the quasi-7th grade crystal essence. After a glance, although she could see that this crystal essence was not a true 7th grade crystal essence, its quasi-7th grade crystal essence was enough to shock Maihani. Then, she thought that with Yan Chutian's current state, He was probably going to use this quasi-7th grade crystal essence to break through to the 5th level of the Heaven Mansion stage. Thinking of this, although she was happy for Yen Chutian in her heart, she did not forget to pretend to be dissatisfied and lightly snorted. I didn't expect that I would be caught up by you so soon after being stronger than you for such a short time. Chapter 8:21. Compared to others, my Hani, who had gone through life and death with Yen Chutian, was naturally more aware of the former's strength. Therefore, she could estimate that if Yen Chutian broke through to the 5th level of the Heaven Palace stage, he would be able to compete with the Tianfuging 6th floor cultivators. Yen Chutian did not refute my Hani's words because my Hani's thoughts were almost the same as his. If he stepped into the 5th level of the Heaven Palace stage, the range of his Heaven Palace should be able to reach 6,700 feet. Such a vast Heaven Palace foundation was something that many Tianfuging 6th floor cultivators couldn't possess. Therefore, it didn't matter even if they didn't have time to polish it. Therefore, why would he need to be afraid of the Tianfuging 6th floor cultivators? In other words, the higher his cultivation level, the greater the Heaven Palace foundation he could possess, and the more shocking it would be for him to be able to fight those above his level. However, Yen Chutian was also clear that if this situation were to continue, there would definitely be a significant decrease in the number of gold disciples. After all, the golden disciples were geniuses second only to the highest level jade tablet in their respective factions. Naturally, the range of the Heaven Palace in their bodies couldn't be underestimated. Moreover, Yen Chutian himself knew that being able to become a Jade Tablet disciple after stepping into the Heavenly Source stage wasn't just based on the fact that he had stepped into the Heavenly Source stage. More importantly, they had to show that they were not weak in terms of talent or strength. One could imagine that the range of one's foundation in the Heaven Palace stage was definitely an extremely important criterion. However, Yen Chutian hadn't experienced so much in his previous life. This was because after his master brought him back to the Cloud Sky faction in his previous life, he had always been cultivating in secret. Very few people knew about him. Later on, when he revealed himself, he was already one of the best in the Heavenly Source stage. He even directly obtained the position of the number 1 disciple of the Cloud Sky faction. Everyone knew what happened after that. Yen Chutian's life was smooth sailing from beginning to end. He became the number 1 disciple of the Firmament Palace and eventually became one of the top 10 geniuses of the Heaven Realm. However, he had infiltrated the God domain after reaching the 8th Heaven Genesis stage. Back to the main topic, as long as he could break through to the 5th level of the Tianfuging 7th floor, he wouldn't need to fear anyone. If he was given more time to carefully polish his Heaven's sanctum, then even the disciples of the Tianfuging 7th floor would find it difficult to look down on him. However, this was something that would happen after the breakthrough. If he couldn't break through, everything would just be empty talk. All his hopes were pinned on the quasi-grade 7 crystal marrow in his hands. Slowly sitting down in the crowd, Yen Chutian was not polite to my Hani at all. He immediately looked at her expectantly. "Senior Sister Hani, I'll leave the rest to you." Wu Hani was well aware of the meaning behind Yen Chutian's words, but upon hearing those words, other than nodding in agreement, what else could he do? Seeing Wu Hani nod his head, how could Yen Chutian possibly hesitate? He immediately sat down cross-legged and began to slowly refine the crimson crystal essence in his palm that had its aura concealed. Seeing this, my Hani was obviously a little worried. She formed a seal with her jade-like hands and condensed a spiritual energy barrier around Yen Chutian, who was sitting cross-legged. Although the possibility of someone daring to make a move in such a place was infinitely close to zero, but for the sake of safety, she still set up such a defense. After setting up the defense, my Hani sat down cross-legged near Yen Chutian and slowly studied her own Heaven's sanctum. Not long after she entered the Tianfuging 6th floor, her own Heaven's sanctum foundation needed to be tempered. At the same time, on the other side, No matter how angry he was, Tai Yen finally adjusted his state of mind and appeared in the crowd with a gloomy face. Seeing Tai Yan's figure, Ba Xian hurriedly walked out. He saw that Ba Xian's expression was a little off, but he felt that it was a little strange. The other party should be spying on Yen Yun, but just spying, how could he show such a face? Tai Yen was furious, so even when he saw Ba Xian approaching, he did not give him a good face. This made Ba Xian's expression not very good, but there was nothing he could do. After all, he still entrusted the other party to find trouble with Yen Yun. Almost ignoring Ba Xian, Tai Yen only looked coldly at Yen Chutian. But now Yen Chutian could not notice his gaze. What he could feel was Mai Hani, who was guarding beside him. Quietly adjusting his state of mind, Yen Chutian did not officially start refining the quasi-grade 7 crystal marrow in his hand until an hour later. As he slowly refined it, wisps of extremely pure crystal marrow power flowed rapidly into his body through the wings of his nose and finally converged into the heavens sanctum. During this process, if Yen Chutian had not deliberately concealed it, the extremely rich aura of the crystal marrow would have attracted the attention of many disciples around him. As the power of the crystal marrow continued to converge, Yen Chutian did not dare to relax his mind at all. Instead, he absorbed the power of the crystal marrow and hurriedly grasped the mystery of breaking through the boundary wall. However, it seemed that every breakthrough was destined to be full of twists and turns. Because of this, he could not grasp the traces of the breakthrough for a full 2 hours. This made Yen Chutian a little anxious, because even if he slowed down, the crystal marrow in his hand had almost been refined by him. If he still did not gain anything, he was afraid that his attempt to break through this time would only end in failure. However, despite his anxiety, many years of experience eventually allowed Yen Chutian to gradually stabilize his state of mind. Because it was useless to be anxious, it was better to use the last bit of crystal marrow power to make one last attempt at breaking through instead of doing something useless. It seemed that the heavens were looking out for Yen Chutian, or that after all the twists and turns, there would always be a rainbow. After one last attempt at breaking through, Yen Chutian finally grasped the traces of the breakthrough in the illusory world. It was also at this moment that the tiny Yuanying figure sitting cross-legged in his heaven's sanctum finally opened its eyes. Then, as it slowly rose, heavy energy axes continuously condensed in its hands and around its body. Since he had grasped the traces of the breakthrough, the following process was naturally no problem for an experienced Yen Chutian. It could almost be described as smooth sailing. Half a day later, Yen Chutian had truly stepped into the 5th level of the heavens sanctum realm. The moment he broke through to the 5th level of the heavens sanctum realm, even if Yen Chutian had concealed himself, there was still an energy ripple emanating from his body. As long as one did not deliberately ignore it, everyone would be able to sense that the energy ripple should have reached the 5th level of the heavens sanctum realm. When they looked in the direction of the movement, they could naturally see where the energy ripple originated from. Of course, it was not difficult to figure out that Yen Chutian had probably broken through to the 5th level of the heavens sanctum realm. If an ordinary disciple had broken through to the 5th level of the heavens sanctum realm, they would at most take a glance before shifting their gazes away. However, the target was Yen Chutian. Even if they did not want to, they simply could not do it. This was because Yen Chutian's performance in the past could not be viewed with common sense. Based on the strength that he had previously displayed, now that he had broken through to the 5th level of the heavens sanctum realm, even the time-fuging 6th floor cultivators would be nothing in front of him. Of course, this was only what everyone thought. Without seeing it with their own eyes, no one knew what would happen. Therefore, many disciples of the time-fuging 6th floor, especially those at the pinnacle and perfection level, had paid attention to Yen Chutian, but they did not pay much attention to him. To be able to reach such a level, they all had their own pride. Naturally, they would not easily think that a cultivator at the 5th level of the heaven's sanctum realm would be so powerful. Although the other party could not be viewed with ordinary eyes, as long as they treated him seriously and did not underestimate him, then the other party would still be nothing. Looking at Yan Chutian, Tai Yan's face became extremely gloomy again. This was because he completely guessed that Lin Yun had probably refined the quasi-7th grade crystal marrow to be able to break through to the 5th level of the heavens sanctum realm. In his view, it was a huge waste for a quasi-7th grade crystal marrow to be used on breaking through to the 5th level of the heavens sanctum realm. That level of crystal marrow should belong to him, allowing him to advance towards the pinnacle and perfection level of the Tianfuging 6th floor. Only in this way could the overall strength of the Cloud Sky bloodline increase a little. Chapter 8:22. The energy ripples spread out and quickly returned to calmness. When the energy ripples returned to calmness, Yan Chutian naturally opened his eyes after sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed for a long time. Opening his eyes, even the current Yan Chutian could not restrain the joy on his face. Because it was as he had thought before, he had truly broken through to the 5th level of the Heaven Mansion stage, and the range of the Heavenly Palace did not disappoint his expectations. From the original 5,200 feet, it expanded to a range of 6,800 feet. With such a huge foundation of the Heavenly Palace, even if it had not been polished in any way, it still made him feel that his foundation was extremely abundant. Even if it was a cultivator from the Tianfuging 6th floor, he could forget about taking any advantage from his hands. As a result, he did not restrain his aura and immediately cast a gaze filled with fighting spirit in the direction of Tai Yan. The current him was no longer the same as before. If the other party still dared to find trouble with him, then he did not mind letting him know that the current situation between the two of them was no longer the same as before. Of course, he would not forget the real culprit behind all of this. That Ba Xian, he would naturally find an opportunity to settle the score with him. But in reality, the current Ba Xian was nothing in Yan Chutian's eyes. At most, he was just a clown who relied on Ba Hong's power to secretly make moves. Yan Chutian's gaze, one could imagine how gloomy and angry the face of Tai Yan, who was already unwilling and jealous, would become at this moment. It was hard for him to imagine that the other party had become so arrogant. Could it be that he thought that just because he had stepped into the 5th level of the Heaven Mansion stage, he could still accumulate his strength to fight above his level to the Tianfuging 6th floor? In the past, it was only because he despicably showed weakness to the enemy that he was able to take advantage of the opportunity to launch a sneak attack and even succeed in the sneak attack. But if he lost this early stage, what could he be considered as in an open and above-board manner? The anger in Tai Yan's heart surged, but no matter how turbulent it was, he had no choice but to suppress it, because right now was definitely not the time to make a move. Moreover, he suddenly thought that this was probably done on purpose by Yan Yun in order to provoke him. If he really lost control of his anger, wouldn't he have fallen for his despicable trick? However, it was obvious that he was thinking too much. Yan Chutian wouldn't think so much about him. After all, he was no longer an enemy that was difficult to defeat to the former. That glare was just a subconscious way of venting the anger of being secretly targeted by the former. Therefore, in the next moment, Yan Chutian returned to normal. Then, he continued to sit cross-legged and stabilize his cultivation. Since Yan Chutian had already broken through, Maihani naturally did not need to be as solemn as before. Thus, she lifted her jade-like hand and dispersed the spiritual energy barrier. Then, her red lips parted slightly as she said, "Congratulations on truly breaking through to the 5th level of the Heaven Mansion stage. What? Do you want to strike while the iron is hot and borrow some more crystal essences from me to polish your Heaven Palace as soon as possible?" Hearing Maihani's soft words, Yan Chutian raised his eyebrows because he really didn't have a single crystal essence on him now. If he could borrow some more crystal essences, it would be for the best. However, what made him a little suspicious was that my Hani seemed to be a little too nice to him. He hadn't even paid back the crystal essences he borrowed the last time, yet she was still willing to lend them to him? He definitely couldn't accept someone else's kindness for no reason. However, he couldn't let go of the crystal essences that were delivered to his doorstep. Thus, after hesitating for a moment, Yen Chutian immediately said, "Senior Sister Hani, I can't thank you enough for your kindness. In the future, as long as Senior Sister has any instructions, Yen Yun will definitely not refuse, even if it means climbing a mountain of swords or diving into a sea of fire." Due to Yen Chutian's sudden words, my Hani couldn't help but be at a loss. However, what made her happy was that it sounded like Yen Chutian owed her a request. This sounded extremely good. In the future, if there was anything she was dissatisfied with, she could use this request to ask him directly until she was satisfied. With that thought in mind, my Hani's next action of taking out the crystal essences was even more extravagant. She only left behind some crystal essences for herself to polish her divine abode in the next few days. Then, she lent the rest of the resources to Yen Chutian. Of course, although she said she was lending them, my Hani had never thought of returning them at all. Although they had both admitted that they were friends, my Hani had always thought that they could only maintain a relationship with each other if they were involved in some substantial relationship. Otherwise, if they weren't involved, their relationship would fade with the passage of time, no matter how nice it sounded. However, my Hani didn't want their relationship to fade away because of time. After getting the crystal essences from my Hani, Yen Chutian's next step was even simpler. He didn't even need to look for the crystal essences. He could directly refine the ones in his hands and polish his divine abode. However, when it came to polishing, Yen Chutian realized how huge the amount of crystal essences he needed to polish his divine abode was. The crystal essences that my Hani gave him were of good quality, and there were even several pieces of 5th-grade crystal essences. However, after refining them, the polishing effect was extremely poor. After another half a day, he exhausted all the crystal essences in his hands. However, the effect was only to refine the heaven palace in his body by 2,000 feet. However, Yen Chutian wasn't too disappointed. After all, he knew that the more difficult the polishing of his divine abode was, the greater his foundation would be. In other words, if he could easily polish his divine abode, it would mean that his divine abode's foundation would be extremely weak. It would also be impossible for him to have the strength to fight those above his level like before. Therefore, even though he had used up all the crystal essences, Yen Chutian's mood didn't change much. In any case, he just recovered to his previous state and continued to search for crystal essences in the floating mountain. However, just as Yen Chutian was thinking this, a light beam rippled and shot up to the sky from a huge mountain in the distance that seemed to be at the end of the horizon. Immediately after, an extremely ferocious beast roar resounded in the sky amidst the loud rumbling sound. Enormous energy ripples spread out. Even though there was an extremely great distance between them, one could still feel an extremely large amount of pressure. Everyone could vaguely see a gigantic marrow beast roaring towards the sky on top of the collapsed mountain. The source of the gigantic pressure was none other than this beast. Looking at this scene, even though he didn't know what was going on, Yen Chutian could faintly sense that the appearance of this marrow beast was the beginning of a storm. Even though they were quite a distance away, he could still vaguely sense that this marrow beast's strength had most likely reached the 8th level of the divine abode stage. To be able to nurture such a marrow beast, it wasn't difficult to imagine what level of crystal essences existed in the collapsed mountain. This scene was clearly visible to everyone. In other words, as long as one had a bit of insight, they would be able to guess what he was thinking. In other words, it wouldn't be long before all the disciples of the floating mountain gathered around the giant mountain. After all, everyone had come here for the sake of this opportunity. Therefore, at this moment, when the greatest opportunity had appeared, how could they give it up? This was also the case for the Cloud Sky faction that Yan Chutian was in. Whether it was Ba Hong Yuanyang or Zhang Yu, they could also imagine that such a commotion would definitely attract the disciples of the various factions, including the Tianyang faction. But even if they knew, the four of them didn't hesitate at all. They immediately ordered all the disciples to head towards the source of the commotion. In the floating mountain, or rather in the sky desert, it was a fight for opportunities. Therefore, they were very clear that if the opportunity appeared and they didn't even have the courage to fight for it, what was the difference between that and failure? Therefore, even if the Tianyang faction stood in front of them, they still had to go. Moreover, they didn't believe that the Tianyang faction would dare to act against them when all the disciples of the various factions were gathered. Weren't they afraid that others would take advantage of them? Moreover, apart from the Kong Tong faction, as long as the disciples of the other factions weren't fools, they definitely wouldn't watch the Tianyang faction dominate and act so arrogantly. All in all, under the lead of the four people, the disciples of the Cloud Sky faction all controlled their spiritual energies and turned into streaks of light as they charged towards the collapsed mountain, even though they had complicated thoughts in their hearts. At the same time, the entire floating mountain was filled with such scenes. The storm had finally descended. Chapter 8:23. The originally calm atmosphere in the floating mountain range was completely shattered by the collapse of the giant mountain and the ferocious roar of the enormous marrow beast. Immediately after, countless streaks of light shot over from all over the world. The target of these streaks of light was, without exception, the floating mountain. This was because anyone who sensed the strength of the marrow beast would not find it hard to imagine that there was an extremely high grade of crystal marrow within the mountain. Otherwise, no matter how many crystal marrow there were, without the stimulation of high-grade crystal marrow, the marrow beast would not be able to break through the crystal marrow level. After all, the birth of the marrow beast was an extremely coincidental situation. A marrow beast that was born from crystal marrow would naturally not be of a higher grade than crystal marrow. All in all, within a short period of time, there were figures whizzing over from various parts of the floating mountain, descending around the collapsed giant mountain. Yan Chutian looked over and could clearly see the Tianyang, Kongtong, Xianling, Tianjin, and Freezing Sky factions. Including the Cloud Sky faction, the 6 factions that had appeared had already surpassed half of the 8 factions. With such 6 factions, there was no need to doubt the strength of the Tianyang faction. The 2 factions from the Tianyang faction had gathered. Just the commander prodigies from the Tianfujing 7th floor alone numbered 7. However, even if they excluded the Tianyang faction, the Cloud Sky faction was no longer the strongest among the remaining 5 factions. It could clearly be seen that the number of disciples from the Freezing Sky faction had also surpassed 1 faction. Moreover, the number of commander prodigies from the Tianfujing 7th floor had already reached 5. In other words, 3 factions had already sent reinforcements. Although the Kongtong faction did not have any reinforcements, there was no need to worry. After all, the Kongtong faction had always been extremely close to the Tianyang faction. Right now, although they did not look like they were walking together, once they started fighting, they would definitely walk together. The remaining Xianling faction and Tianjin faction seemed to be the weakest. However, they were obviously aware of this situation. Therefore, both sides seemed to have reached some kind of agreement and were now walking together. This was not strange to the Xianling lineage, but the Celestial Array lineage's actions clearly meant that they no longer wanted to remain neutral and wanted to take the initiative to compete. Therefore, rather than saying that there were 6 factions, it would be more accurate to say that there were only 4 factions left in the Hanging Mountain. The target of these 4 forces was the high-grade crystal marrow in the collapsed mountain. If the crystal marrow were to appear, the 4 forces would probably start fighting for it immediately. However, the marrow crystals hadn't really appeared yet, not to mention the enormous marrow beast that was poking its head out of the crack in the collapsed mountain. Everyone could clearly sense the strength of this marrow beast. It must have reached the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm. With such a marrow beast in front of them, not only would it be extremely difficult to kill it, but they were also worried that if they made a move against it, the disciples of the other factions would take the opportunity to launch a sneak attack on them. If they were ambushed, the situation would be extremely bad. With this powerful marrow beast in front of them and the disciples of the other factions attacking them from behind, they would probably be eliminated from the competition. Therefore, the geniuses of the various factions quickly suggested that they work together to kill the marrow beast first. Everyone agreed with this suggestion. Therefore, in the next moment, 2 commander-level geniuses from the Tianfuging 7th floor walked out from the 6 factions. The 12 disciples of the Tianfuging 7th floor from the 6 factions walked out. With such a joint force, they had no need to fear the marrow beast even if it was at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm. After all, the marrow beast was indeed powerful, but it didn't have intelligence. On the other hand, with the 12 of them working together, even if each of them had only just entered the Tianfuging 7th floor, the power they could unleash should be comparable to that of an ordinary 8th-level Heaven Mansion realm cultivator. Moreover, if they still couldn't defeat it, the disciples of the 6 factions weren't just for show. They could provide support at any time. Since the suggestion was made, the 12 of them didn't linger. Each of them immediately controlled their spiritual power and charged towards the marrow beast that was at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm. Although the marrow beast didn't have intelligence, it still had its instincts. Therefore, when the 12 of them rushed out, the marrow beast at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm sensed them and immediately turned its head. Then, it quickly opened its ferocious mouth. The ferocious beast's mouth was like a black hole that could swallow heaven and earth, sucking in the surrounding space and creating a spatial gap. With such an absorption, one could imagine how terrifying the power accumulated in its mouth was. This kind of power caused the 8th level of the Heaven Palace realm marrow beast to roar as it shot out. Even the most elite of the various factions, not a single one of them dared to face it head-on, and they all dodged to the side. The energy beam whizzed past and directly tore apart the space between heaven and earth, revealing a huge spatial fault that wreaked havoc with an astonishing spatial power. After dodging such a blow, the 12 geniuses no longer hesitated. Otherwise, if they allowed the marrow beast to continue its wanton attacks, who knew if they would be hit by it unintentionally? The more they were dealing with a creature that only had power, the more they had to take the initiative in the battle in their own hands. In the next moment, spiritual power surged wildly in the hands of each of the 12 people. Then, all kinds of spiritual techniques appeared one by one and enveloped the marrow beast at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm. However, at this time, the marrow beast at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm also displayed its strength. As the myriad of attacks descended, it once again took a deep breath and sucked in a huge spatial depression. Then, when it exhaled and absorbed the power in its mouth, it had already turned into an extremely eye-catching purple flame. The purple flame melted and the space collapsed, making it difficult for it to exist. In front of this power, no matter how the myriad of attacks descended, they were all turned into nothingness by the purple flame. Looking at this scene, although the 12 people had more or less expected it, they couldn't help but reveal a trace of shock on their faces. Even they had to admit that even if it was just a marrow beast, as long as it stepped into the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm, its strength couldn't be ignored. If any one of them were to face it alone, or even 2 of them, they would probably end up in a very sorry state and might even be eliminated. However, there was no such if. At this moment, with the 12 of them attacking, even if the marrow beast at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm was extremely strong, it would still fall before their eyes. The final result was indeed so. Even though the marrow beast at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm was extremely strong, under the entanglement of the 12 people, its strength was ultimately exhausted bit by bit. Even in the end, the marrow beast felt the danger and wanted to escape. However, how could the others give it the chance? They immediately sealed off its escape route, and a dozen powerful spiritual techniques descended from the sky, enveloping the former like a storm. Roar! This time, no matter how strong the marrow beast was, it still let out an extremely mournful roar. When the energy ripples calmed down, it was even more clearly visible that there were already several hideous wounds on the marrow beast's body. In such a situation, it was almost obvious that the outcome was in the bag. Then, without any explanation, the 12 people once again gathered the spiritual energy in their hands. However, when the surging attacks descended this time, a shocking change suddenly occurred. It could clearly be seen that the two commander prides of the Tianyang faction didn't attack the marrow beast, but Zhang Yu and Ba Hong from the Cloud Sky faction. If it weren't for the fact that the two of them were already on guard, this attack would have seriously injured them. Even so, the two of them were forced to continuously retreat after forcefully blocking the attack, and the blood and qi in their bodies shook. However, no matter how much the blood and qi in their bodies shook, it couldn't compare to the furious expressions on their faces. They really didn't think that the disciples of the Tianyang faction would be so shameless. They actually went against the agreement and attacked in front of everyone. Because of this, it was obvious that Yuan Yang and the other disciples of the Cloud Sky faction wouldn't just watch and do nothing. They immediately released their spiritual energy and looked at the two commander prides of the Tianyang faction with extremely sharp gazes. Towards the reaction of Ba Hong, Zhang Yu, and the other disciples of the Cloud Sky faction, one of the prides of the Tianyang faction, Fang Xiang, who was dressed in black armor, had an indifferent expression and said with a faint smile, "Haha, it's just a joke." However, it seems that the disciples of the Cloud Sky faction aren't that bad. Chapter 824. Under the sharp gazes of the Cloud Sky bloodline, Fang Xiang spoke in such a casual manner. However, which Cloud Sky bloodline disciple would be so easily brushed aside by him? The disciples of the Cloud Sky bloodline were like this, not to mention Zhang Yu and Ba Hong, who were ambushed. Their expressions were extremely ugly. The two of them tightly locked onto Fang Xiang. Their cold gazes clearly indicated that it was impossible for the other party to easily brush aside the sneak attack just now. After all, that sneak attack was a direct threat to them. If they hadn't been vigilant, they would have ended up in an extremely ugly state. Sensing the cold gazes of the two, Fang Xiang and the other genius of the Tianyang bloodline all had indifferent expressions, as if they didn't care about how the two of them would react. Fang Xiang once again spoke with a faint smile. "What, could it be that your Cloud Sky bloodline wants to directly attack here? If that's the case, then my Tianyang bloodline doesn't mind accompanying you to the end." At this point, Fang Xiang no longer used any words. He, or rather, the Tianyang bloodline, was clearly deliberately targeting his Cloud Sky bloodline and wanted to make a move against them. However, at this point, not to mention Ba Hong and Zhang Yu, how could the spectators of the Cloud Sky bloodline at the foot of the giant mountain suppress the anger in their hearts? The Tianyang bloodline unabashedly attacked the geniuses of their Cloud Sky bloodline. It was obvious that they had ill intentions towards them. If they could still endure at this time, wouldn't they be admitting that their Cloud Sky bloodline was a soft persimmon? As a result, before Ba Hong and Zhang Yu could speak, there were many firm shouts from the Cloud Sky bloodline's disciples. "Tianyang bloodline, if you want to fight, then let's fight." Following the orderly shouts of the Cloud Sky bloodline's disciples, the atmosphere between them and the Tianyang bloodline had completely formed. However, at this moment, the two bloodlines were facing each other. No matter how one looked at it, the Cloud Sky bloodline was the weaker one. After all, just in the Tianyang bloodline's camp, there were a total of 7 commanders of the Tianfujing 7th floor. At this moment, no other faction could compare to this number of top-notch geniuses. Not to mention, beside the Tianyang's faction was the Kongtong faction's faction. Both sides were already on the same side, so if they really fought, how could they remain indifferent? Hence, Ba Hong and the rest, who were clearly aware of this, immediately turned their gazes towards the surrounding groups of disciples from the other factions. In the current situation, it could be said that the Tianyang bloodline was the only one in power. Therefore, as long as one had some brains, they wouldn't be able to watch the Tianyang bloodline be so arrogant. However, even though the situation was like this, standing out was directly opposing the Tianyang bloodline. Therefore, even if it was a group of disciples from the other factions, how could they easily stand out? After all, if he failed, it would mean that he would be eliminated. Thus, even the Profound Spirit faction, which had cooperated with the Cloud Sky faction before, didn't immediately step forward. This made Ba Hong and the others furious, but there was nothing they could do. Similarly, when they saw this scene, the commanders of the Tianyang bloodline couldn't help but coldly laugh. However, just at this moment, two beautiful figures suddenly walked out in front of the Cold Sky faction. The two beautiful figures were both born with peerless beauty, and their appearances were extremely similar. However, one of them was extremely mature and unapproachable, while the other was slightly immature. It wasn't that Yan Chutian didn't recognize these two people. Weren't they the Bai sisters, Bai Yanqing and Bai Zining, who had helped them force back the Tianyang disciples in the Crystal Marrow treasure land? When the Bai sisters stood out, the expressions of many of the Tianyang disciples changed. After all, if the lineage of Freezing Sky and the lineage of Cloud Sky walked together at that moment, then the situation would become incredibly strange. Within the Tianyang bloodline, especially Jiang Shao and Shen Yao, Yao Yao's expressions were extremely ugly. At this moment, Yao Yao's expression was extremely ugly. However, they still didn't understand. Back then, the Bai sisters should have fought for the Crystal Marrow, but now they didn't need to do so to obtain the Crystal Marrow they wanted. Could it be that they still had to fight because of this? Bai sisters, don't tell me you still want to stand with the Cloud Sky faction and fight against the Tianyang bloodline today? It was difficult to understand. Yao Yao couldn't help but shout. However, Bai Zining didn't respond to his shout. Instead, Bai Yanqing's expression was indifferent as she calmly opened her red lips and said, "So what? Today, on the floating mountain, the Tianyang bloodline isn't the only one who can cover the sky with one hand." Bai Yanqing's words completely revealed the intentions of the Cold Sky faction. Perhaps if the other commanders of the Tianyang bloodline spoke like this, it wouldn't be convincing enough. However, since the target was one of the Bai sisters, no one would doubt it. The Bai sisters had the backing of the Bai family. Even the gold tablet or jade tablet disciples had to give them some face. The silver tablet disciples were even more respectful towards them. That was why it wasn't an exaggeration to say that the two of them could completely replace the intentions of the Cold Sky faction. That was why Bai Yanqing's words were the same as announcing that the Cold Sky faction was already standing on the same side as the Cloud Sky faction. While the disciples of the Cloud Sky bloodline were shocked by this, a look of joy quickly appeared on their faces. Because if they had the help of the Cold Sky faction, then even if the Tianyang bloodline and the Kong Tong bloodline worked together, they wouldn't be able to easily suppress them. However, there were also quite a few gazes that looked towards Yan Chutian, who was standing beside a certain beautiful figure. Because among the Cloud Sky faction disciples, some of them knew that the Bai sisters had stood on the side of the Cloud Sky faction that day. At that time, the Bai sisters had already treated Yan Yun differently. That was why when the Cold Sky faction stood on their side once again, how could they not let their imaginations run wild? When he sensed the gazes around him, Yan Chutian was speechless. But this time, he wasn't going to be at a loss. The Bai sisters definitely didn't have any ambiguous thoughts towards him. Thus, there was only one possibility. The Cold Sky faction truly didn't want to see the Tianyang bloodline continue to dominate. In truth, when he thought about it, it was simple. Even if the Tianyang bloodline could get along with the other bloodlines after eliminating the Cloud Sky faction, they would definitely take the majority of the crystal marrow in the floating mountain without hesitation. How much difference would there be between making a move at that time and making a move right now? With the Bai sisters' strength and status, how could they not have thought of this? In fact, even all the commander prodigies should know this clearly. However, some of them knew but remained silent. Some of them were afraid of the situation and pretended not to know. In conclusion, when the Cold Sky faction took the initiative to stand on the side of the Cloud Sky faction, it caused the originally one-sided situation to instantly return to a stalemate. Even if everything else was ignored, at the very least, the combined strength of the Cloud Sky faction and the Cold Sky faction was almost on par with the combined strength of the Tianyang and the Kong Tong faction. With the Cloud Sky faction and the Cold Sky faction added together, there were a total of 4 teams and 9 commander prodigies. They only had 1 less commander prodigy compared to the Tianyang and Kong Tong factions. However, even though they had 1 less commander prodigy, they still had an advantage in terms of number of disciples. After all, the Tianyang and Kong Tong factions only had 3 teams of disciples. Thus, in this situation, even the commander prodigies of the Tianyang bloodline, who had been acting extremely domineering and arrogant, had their expressions change slightly. They no longer had the disdain they had before. The fact that the Cold Sky faction stood out at this moment was something they had not expected. Originally, they had thought that even if the other factions would work together to fight for the spirit crystals, they would only do so after the Cloud Sky faction was eliminated. After all, no matter how many crystal essences there were in the floating mountain, they should not want to have one more faction to share. Or else, no matter how large their share of the crystal essences was, the number of crystal essences would decrease. However, no matter how well they had thought, no one would have thought that the Cold Sky faction would stand out at this moment. And because they had stood out, the situation had become extremely bad. If they truly fought, even if they could win, they would have to pay a great price. In fact, even whether they could win or not was risky. However, they had already said those arrogant and domineering words just now. How could they take them back? If they retreated now, it would mean that the Tianyang bloodline was afraid. Chapter 8:25. The 6 factions were gathered at the center of the floating mountain range. Although the marrow beast within the collapsed mountain had already been annihilated by the combined efforts of everyone, the tense atmosphere did not dissipate. Instead, it grew increasingly intense. The opposing faction could be said to be the strongest faction in the inner sect of the Firmament God Palace. However, due to the special circumstances of the floating mountain, the Tianyang faction could not be underestimated even though they were the strongest faction. Because at that moment, the Cloud Sky faction had already joined forces with the Freezing Sky faction. With the 4 squads from the 2 factions added together, the overall power they possessed was equivalent to the combined power of the Heavenly Sun faction and the Kongtong faction. Thus, even the commanders and prodigies from the Tianyang faction felt as if they could not advance or retreat. After all, the Cloud Sky and Freezing Sky factions added together were not weak. If they truly fought with everything they had, even if they could win, the price they would have to pay would be too great. Not to mention, there were also the disciples of the Heaven Array sect and the Profound Spirit sect. Although these 2 sects did not seem to have any intention of interfering, who could guarantee that if the 2 sides fought to the point where both sides were injured, the other side would not suddenly sit back and reap the benefits? This was also the reason why the prodigies from the Tianyang faction were even more worried. After all, although they did not like the Cloud Sky faction and wanted nothing more than to stomp them to death, all of this was built on the premise that they did not harm their own interests. If they hurt the enemy while losing 800 of their own, they would not be able to obtain any benefit. Who would be willing to do such a thing? Thus, as they hesitated, the gazes of the many prodigies from the Tianyang faction quickly turned towards the disciples from the Heaven Array and Profound Spirit factions. Although these two factions were troublesome third parties, if they could pull them into their faction, they would not only be third parties, they would also become a considerable power. If they could pull the two factions into their faction, then even if the Cloud Sky faction and Freezing Sky faction worked together, they would not be a problem. However, when the Tianyang faction's prides looked over, the two leaders of the Heaven Array faction and the leader of the Profound Spirit faction seemed to have expected this. They decisively said, "Ha, today, we have formed our own faction. Therefore, we will not join any faction. Don't worry, if the two of you fight, we will definitely not interfere." The words of the two supreme leaders were equivalent to directly sealing off all cooperation. After all, they knew that the so-called cooperation at this time was not reliable. Even if he won, he probably wouldn't get much of the benefit. Rather than that, it was naturally better to remain neutral. Although Tianyang's prodigies were very displeased with how crafty the Tianjun and Xianling factions were. But no matter how unhappy they were, they would not show it. Otherwise, if the two factions were to be forced towards each other because of this, wouldn't it instead cause the situation on his side to become extremely bad? It was just that the situation had returned to the situation at the beginning, back to the situation of not being able to make a move. However, the stalemate would eventually be broken. No matter how rigid the situation was, it would eventually be broken. Moreover, the supreme leader of the Tianyang faction also thought that if the hard way did not work, he would use the soft way. As long as the other factions were separated, the Tianyang faction would still be the strongest faction. Even if they could not directly eliminate the Cloud Sky faction's disciples, they could still indirectly suppress them. Therefore, within the Tianyang faction, Shen Wuling directly took a step forward and said to the other two factions, "Everyone, now is not the final moment of the Sky Desert world. Therefore, there is no need for us to fight to the death." Shen Wuling's words not only made the Cloud Sky faction's disciples, but also the Kongtong faction's disciples, who wore the same pants as them, curled their lips. After all, it was clearly the Tianyang faction's disciples who were the most arrogant and instigated the conflict. At this moment, seeing that the situation was not good, they were truly shameless to say such words. However, even so, everyone did not directly refute and only responded with silence. However, in many cases, silence was equivalent to tacit agreement. Therefore, Shen Wuling immediately continued, "The reason we are gathered here is none other than the crystal marrow hidden in this mountain. In that case, it's simple. We will pick some disciples from each faction. Based on the outcome of the battle between them, we will distribute the crystal marrow each faction can get." Shen Wuling's intention was to limit the large-scale battle between the factions to a small controllable range. One had to admit that this was not only a situation that the Tianyang faction was happy to see, but also a situation that the other factions would rather see. This way, not only would they be able to fairly distribute the crystal marrow opportunity, but it would also not cause any faction to lose too much. Therefore, not long after Shen Wuling finished speaking, all the factions nodded in agreement. Seeing this, the smile on Shen Wuling's face became even wider and he continued, "Since all the factions have agreed, we can now explain the general rules. First of all, the Tianyang faction will not take advantage of the other factions. We will pick 10 disciples from each faction from the Tianfujing 6th floor. Based on the outcome of the 10 disciples from each faction, the number of crystal marrow opportunities will be determined." Shen Wuling's previous words made the Tianyang faction's disciples unable to find any fault with them. However, the final restriction of the rules suddenly made some disciples, as well as Shen Wuling. The expressions of Yao and Jiang Shao changed slightly. This was because they could not help but recall the battle in the crystal marrow treasured land that day. At that time, she and Shen Wuling had been together. Yao had also used this method to determine the outcome of the battle between the two factions. However, it was this method of battle that they thought they had a 90% chance of winning in the end, and the main reason was that strange disciple from the Cloud Sky faction. Clearly, his cultivation was only at the Tianfuging 4th floor, but his cultivation was comparable to the 5th level of the Tianfuging realm. He had even defeated one of the disciples with extraordinary strength under his command. Therefore, when they heard the similar rules at this moment, how could they remain calm? This was especially so when they saw that Yan Chutian's cultivation seemed to have stepped into the 5th level of the Tianfuging realm. This made their expressions change even more. However, after thinking about it for a moment, they ultimately did not think that Lin Fan, who had stepped into the 5th level of the Tianfuging realm, would be able to inherit the ability to fight against those above his level and compete with the Tianfuging 6th floor cultivators. Moreover, the Tianyang faction would have a greater advantage if they had a disciple with a higher cultivation. Therefore, such a situation should be more advantageous for them. With this thought in mind, the two of them, as well as the other disciples, gradually calmed down. At the same time, Shen Wuling, who was completely unaware of this, continued to speak about the so-called rules. The rules he spoke of sounded very fair, and no one could find fault with them. Therefore, the various factions quickly began to pick out 10 disciples from the Tianfuging 6th floor. At this moment, many disciples of the Cloud Sky bloodline subconsciously turned their gazes to Yan Chutian. Although the latter looked like he had just stepped into the 5th level of the Tianfuging realm not long ago, everyone knew that his strength could not be measured by his superficial strength. Therefore, they were naturally curious. Would he stand out and take one of the spots at this time? Yan Chutian did not show any signs of cowardice despite being stared at by so many people. He did not know the strength of the others, but he was quite confident in his own strength. Therefore, he could not retreat at this time, and immediately walked out of the crowd step by step. Of course, my Hani, who was beside him, did not show any signs of weakness. As she walked lightly, an enormous pressure spread out from her delicate body. It was enough to cause all the surrounding disciples to subconsciously take a step back. My Hani did not need to be said. Back then, she had killed a disciple from the Tianfuging 6th floor of the Kongtong faction. Therefore, even if her cultivation was not at the peak of the Tianfuging 6th floor, she had undoubtedly obtained a spot. As for Yan Chutian, perhaps he would cause some disputes among the disciples. However, with the series of previous performances, even if there were disciples who opposed him, their voices were very soft and did not dare to be loud. However, not everyone was like that. Soon, a figure walked out from the crowd and looked at Yan Chutian with a condescending gaze. He did not conceal his disdain as he said, "This kind of occasion isn't a place where any random person can step up. Not to mention, it's just a lucky bastard who managed to accumulate some so-called fame." P.S. The next chapter will be delayed indefinitely because the results are very bad, so it will be ending directly. Now Blue Sky is preparing a new book. If fate wills it, I hope we will meet again in the new book. Chapter 826. The tumultuous hustle and bustle finally calmed down. The youth in the haze suddenly raised his gaze, but what he really saw was only the 4 stone walls, and in this stone room there was a seemingly eternal spiritual light. Yan Chutian raised his gaze, still looking around blankly. Gradually, a clear light slowly emerged in his line of sight. His mind was filled with thoughts. He remembered that he had died in the hands of the ghost venerables. He remembered that he had been reborn in the mortal world, and then rose all the way back to the heaven realm. Yan Chutian didn't expect that the effect of this Tao sculpting heavenly spirit fruit would be so miraculous. It could actually let people experience an almost rebirth experience. And this experience had given him a great harvest, and he was not far from a breakthrough. However, when he recalled that extremely realistic experience, and realized that it was actually a fabrication, he sighed in his heart. However, Yan Chutian understood that this was the way of the great Tao. Moreover, there was a more important reality for him now. The end of the book.